I never thought my quiet piece of land, the one I inherited from my grandfather and lovingly nurtured for years, would turn into the epicenter of one of the most absurd battles of my life. The land was a sprawling 200 acres of untouched wilderness, rolling hills, ancient trees, and a small, meandering creek running through it. It wasn't just property, it was my sanctuary, a place where I found peace away from the chaos of the city. But that all changed one sunny morning when I drove up to check on the land and was greeted by a sea of construction vehicles, bulldozers, and half-finished mansions rising like concrete monstrosities from the earth. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. How could anyone be building on my land? I'd never sold an inch of it. The boundary markers were clear, the survey maps were unambiguous, and there was no record of any permits issued in my name or anyone else's for that matter. Yet, there they were, 114 colossal houses, each bigger than the last, stretching over the once pristine hills where deer once roamed and birds sang. It was as if some greedy developer had decided overnight to plop an entire neighborhood on my backyard. As I drove closer, I noticed the unmistakable sign of an HOA, Homeowners Association, posted near the entrance of the new development. The sign was pristine, glossy, and screamed of exclusivity. Welcome to Willow Creek Estates, a premier community managed by the Willow Creek HOA. I frowned. Willow Creek. That name didn't ring any bells, but the most infuriating part was the fact that the HOA's office trailer was parked right on my property. A middle-aged woman with a perfectly coiffed bob haircut and oversized sunglasses stood beside it, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the construction crews like a drill sergeant. She had that type of presence that immediately made you want to roll your eyes. The archetypal Karen of HOA lore, the kind who thinks every blade of grass and mailbox is under her strict regime. I approached cautiously, trying to remain calm despite my rising anger. "Excuse me," I said, stepping out of my truck. "This is my land. Who gave you permission to build here?" The woman turned, sizing me up with a smug expression. "Well, honey, this is Willow Creek Estates, and the HOA has been in charge of this property for months. You must be mistaken. You should check your records." I shook my head. "I've checked everything. There's no record of you owning or having permission to build on this land. This is private property, and I haven't sold an inch." She snorted, a condescending laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, sweetheart, these things get complicated. Our legal team handled everything. You're just a bit out of the loop." I wanted to scream. How could someone just claim my land and start building houses on it? I felt a mix of disbelief, fury, and helplessness wash over me. But I wasn't the kind of person who backs down easily. I told her firmly, "I want those constructions stopped immediately. You're trespassing." She shrugged and waved her hand dismissively. "Good luck with that. We have permits. Everything's official. You're just going to have to deal with it." I knew this was just the beginning of a nightmare. Over the next few days, I tried to gather more information. I went to the county records office, spoke to neighbors, and contacted local government officials. What I found was both shocking and infuriating. The permits that Karen had claimed were official turned out to be forged, signed by a phantom company that didn't exist. Somehow, the HOA had managed to bypass inspections, ignore zoning laws, and bulldoze right through protected wetlands on my property. The local officials seemed reluctant to get involved, citing bureaucratic red tape and ongoing investigations. Meanwhile, the construction crews kept working as if nothing was wrong. The houses rose higher and higher, each one a gargantuan testament to the audacity of the HOA. The roads were paved, streetlights installed, and landscaping crews planted exotic bushes and flowers that didn't belong in the area. The entire scene was surreal, my land being transformed into a suburban nightmare, all without my consent or even notification. I tried to reason with the HOA members. I attended their meetings, only to be met with icy glares and dismissive remarks. Karen, who seemed to be the president of the HOA board, was particularly hostile. At one meeting, she practically sneered at me, telling the gathered homeowners, "This land was purchased legally. If anyone has a problem, take it up with the courts." But when I asked for proof of the purchase, she dodged the question, changing the subject and accusing me of harassment. The other homeowners seemed oblivious or willfully ignorant. Many were new residents, excited about their huge new houses, unaware or uncaring that their homes stood on stolen land. A few older residents expressed sympathy but said they had signed contracts without realizing the backstory. I realized this was going to be an uphill battle, not just against Karen, but against an entire community invested in ignoring the truth. As frustration grew, I began documenting everything meticulously. I hired a private investigator to look into the HOA's legal claims, and he uncovered a tangled web of fraud, forged documents, and shady dealings. Apparently, Karen had orchestrated a complex scheme involving a front company that bought the land from a crooked local official who had no real ownership. The entire thing was a sham, but unraveling it legally would take years. And in the meantime, the houses would stand tall, blocking my views and destroying the land I loved. I also started speaking to the local media, hoping to shine a spotlight on this injustice. A few reporters showed interest, but most were wary of taking on a story involving powerful HOA interests and possible corruption. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. Meanwhile, tensions escalated. Karen's HOA began sending me increasingly aggressive letters, accusing me of trespassing on their construction site when I came to check on my property. Security guards were hired to patrol the area, and once, when I tried to plant a protest sign near the entrance, they forcibly removed me. The situation was becoming hostile and surreal. Despite all this, I held on to hope. I believed in the law, in justice, and in the power of truth. I filed a lawsuit demanding an immediate halt to construction, an investigation into the land claims, and compensation for the damage already done. But legal battles are slow, and Karen seemed to have endless resources and connections. The community's reaction was mixed. Some neighbors sided with me, horrified by the HOA's arrogance. Others were defensive, refusing to believe their dream homes were built on stolen land. Arguments erupted on social media, escalating into heated debates and even threats. The small town I had once enjoyed for its quiet charm was now divided and chaotic. As weeks turned into months, I watched helplessly as the houses neared completion. Each morning, I'd stand at the edge of my land, staring at the looming structures that had sprung up like weeds overnight. The creek I loved, once clear and full of life, was now clogged with construction debris. The wildlife had vanished. My sanctuary was gone. But beneath my despair, a stubborn fire began to burn. Karen and her HOA had crossed a line, violating my rights, destroying my land, and lying through their teeth. They thought they could get away with it. They thought I would just accept it. They were wrong. That fire grew into a plan, one that would shake the entire neighborhood and change everything. But before that could unfold, I had to prepare, gather allies, and find a way to turn the tables on the HOA, Karen, and her army of 114 oversized houses. After months of watching my land being carved up by bulldozers and paved over by construction crews, I knew the usual routes: legal battles, official complaints, polite requests weren't going to cut it anymore. The HOA, Karen, wasn't just a bureaucratic nuisance. She was a force of nature, a relentless storm of entitlement and arrogance who believed she could steamroll anyone in her way. The more I fought, the more entrenched she and her 114 massive houses became. And as her HOA expanded its grip, the community around me fractured into chaos. It all came to a head at the next HOA annual meeting, which I was determined to attend despite the frost in the air and the icy stares I knew I'd face. I wanted to confront Karen and the board directly, to make them see that I wouldn't just roll over. The venue was a rented hall, decked out in cheap decorations, with a podium and rows of folding chairs. The air smelled of stale coffee and cheap perfume. When I arrived, the room buzzed with a mix of excitement, nervousness, and underlying tension. Neighbors whispered in clusters, some casting curious glances my way, others openly glaring. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by a few members of the HOA board. Her posture screamed dominance. Chin up, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on her lips. The microphone crackled as she began the meeting with a rehearsed speech about community pride, property values, and the future of Willow Creek Estates. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, heart pounding but voice steady. I laid out my case, explaining how the land belonged to me, how the HOA's entire development was based on forged documents and illegal construction, and how their actions had devastated the environment and my property. I spoke about the creek choked with sediment, the wildlife displaced, and the damage to the community's trust. Some homeowners shifted uncomfortably, others scowled. Karen interrupted me mid-sentence with a cutting remark. "You're spreading lies and trying to sabotage the community. If you had any proof, you'd have gone through the courts, not public theatrics." I fired back. "The courts take time, but people deserve the truth now. You can't just steal land and build on it. That's not community. That's conquest." The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. The meeting descended into chaos, with homeowners debating heatedly and Karen trying to regain control with thinly veiled threats. I left feeling both exhausted and more resolved than ever. As days passed, the conflict escalated beyond the meeting room. I began receiving anonymous threats. Letters slipped under my door warning me to drop the matter or face consequences. My truck was vandalized one night, tires slashed, and paint scratched with ominous words. It was clear Karen's HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight. On the legal front, my attorney warned me the HOA had hired the best defense money could buy. Their lawyers were experts in delaying tactics, filing endless motions to stall the case. Meanwhile, construction was deemed grandfathered. So many houses were now legal in the eyes of the local courts despite the initial fraud. It was maddening. One morning, while surveying the damage to my property and the encroaching neighborhood, I had an epiphany. If Karen and her HOA were building on my land illegally, and the courts were too slow or corrupt to act, maybe it was time to fight fire with fire. To hit back where it hurt. The creek running through my land, the one that the HOA had neglected and polluted, was still under my control upstream. The wetlands and small riverbanks were natural floodplains, designed by nature to absorb heavy rains and prevent flooding downstream. But those floodplains had been compromised by the construction and landscaping. So what if I could restore them forcibly, let the water reclaim the land they had stolen? The idea was risky, maybe even illegal, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I began researching flood control, water management, and environmental engineering, diving deep into books, online forums, and consulting experts discreetly. I learned that with the right setup, breaching dams, opening sluices, and redirecting water flows, I could flood the area where the houses sat, making them unlivable or at least forcing the HOA to evacuate and reconsider their invasion. I also knew I had to be careful. Flooding the neighborhood indiscriminately could hurt innocent residents, cause property damage, and land me in serious trouble. So I planned meticulously, mapping out the natural waterways, assessing which houses could be targeted with minimal collateral damage, and timing the flooding for when the HOA least expected it. Meanwhile, I ramped up my public campaign. I organized community meetings with local environmental groups, sympathetic neighbors, and activists. We held protests, wrote letters to newspapers, and documented the environmental destruction caused by the construction. The movement grew, with more people demanding accountability from Karen's HOA and the local authorities. Karen responded predictably. More lawsuits, more threats, more attempts to silence me and my supporters. The HOA hired private security to patrol the area, and I found myself being followed during visits to my land. It felt like a war zone, and in some ways it was. Despite the mounting pressure, I found unexpected allies. A few homeowners came forward privately, admitting they had been deceived and wanted to undo what had been done. Some local officials, embarrassed by the corruption scandal, promised to push harder for investigations. Environmental groups offered technical support and legal advice. With momentum building, I finalized my plan for the flooding. I identified an old, neglected dam upstream on my property, part of a centuries-old irrigation system. The dam had a weak point I could exploit to release stored water into the creek rapidly. If I could open the sluice gates just right after a heavy rainfall, The resulting surge would flood the lower valley, precisely where the 114 houses stood. I also devised a system of temporary levees and channels to direct the water's flow, sparing some areas while targeting others. It was a careful balance of engineering and timing. In the days before executing the plan, I tried to warn the HOA. I sent letters, emails, even attempted to negotiate in person with Karen, proposing a truce, stop building, pay restitution, and start repairing the damage. And I'd call off my plan. She laughed at me, called me a lunatic, and refused to budge. So the die was cast. The night before the planned flooding, I stayed on my land, watching the moonlight reflect off the water in the creek. My heart was pounding, not just from adrenaline, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I knew this was no longer just about property or legal battles. It was about standing up to greed and corruption, reclaiming what was rightfully mine, and making sure no one else could take what they wanted without consequence. As dawn broke, I moved swiftly. I released the sluice gates, sending a powerful rush of water barreling down the creek's channel. The water surged with a roaring fury, swallowing up dry creek beds, pushing over banks, and racing toward the neighborhoods below. From a distance, I watched as the water crept into yards, flooded basements, and surrounded the houses like a creeping tide. Panic rippled through Willow Creek estates as residents woke to find their streets submerged, cars trapped, and homes at risk. The HOA's security scrambled to respond, but the flood moved faster than any of them could manage. Within hours, the community was in chaos. Emergency services were called, people evacuated, and the news spread like wildfire. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling as they captured the surreal sight of a flood reclaiming a suburban neighborhood. The story exploded on social media, drawing national attention. Karen was furious, issuing statements condemning the flooding as vandalism and threatening legal action against me. But public opinion was largely on my side, viewing the flood as a dramatic but justified response to the HOA's illegal takeover. The flooding forced the HOA's hand. Construction halted, legal proceedings accelerated, and negotiations reopened. The houses were damaged, some severely, and many residents demanded answers from Karen and the HOA board. In the aftermath, investigations uncovered the full extent of the fraud and corruption behind Willow Creek Estates. Local officials resigned or were arrested, and the HOA's leadership crumbled. Though the fight was far from over, I had made my stand, and the message was clear. You don't build 114 huge houses on someone's land without consequences. The day I finally unleashed the floodwaters on Willow Creek Estates remains the most surreal, adrenaline-fueled experience of my life. Months of tension, frustration, and planning all boiled down to this moment. Standing on the crest of a hill overlooking my once peaceful land, now marred by sprawling, unauthorized mansions, I felt a strange mix of anger, resolve, and sorrow. I had spent weeks meticulously studying the terrain, water flow, and infrastructure on my property. The old dam upstream was the key, a crumbling relic from an earlier time when this land was used for small-scale farming and irrigation. Nature had long since reclaimed much of the system, but the sluice gates and channels were still operable with some effort. My plan was as bold as it was risky. Use the existing waterway and the weak dam to release a controlled surge that would flood the valley where those 114 massive houses stood. The goal wasn't wanton destruction, it was leverage. The flood would force the HOA Karen and her residents to pause, reconsider, and finally address the illegality of their development. On the morning of the operation, a heavy gray sky hung low over the hills. Overnight rain had soaked the earth, raising the water levels in the creek and filling the dam's reservoir to capacity. It was perfect timing. The ground was already saturated, and the creek was primed for a surge. I arrived at the dam just before dawn, carrying tools, ropes, and a small generator to operate the sluice gates. The air was crisp and still. The only sounds were the gentle rush of water and the distant hum of early morning birds. My hands trembled as I began loosening the bolts on the dam's sluice gate. It was rusted and stubborn, but after careful effort, the gate started to give way. As it slowly opened, water began spilling out in a steady stream, growing rapidly into a roaring torrent. I adjusted the gate's opening to maximize the flow without causing an uncontrollable flood upstream. As the water surged down the creek bed, I made my way back up the hill to a vantage point where I could see the entire valley. The first signs were subtle. The low-lying fields began to glisten with water, patches of soil darkening as the creek expanded its banks. Then, the floodwaters pushed against the foot of the hills where the houses had sprung up. Within minutes, lawns became ponds, roads turned to rivers, and basements flooded. The sound of rushing water echoed through the valley, drowned out only by the frantic shouts of residents rushing to salvage belongings and evacuate. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, but the flood was swift and relentless. Some of the newer houses, built without proper drainage or environmental consideration, were quickly overwhelmed. The water seeped into foundations, damaged electrical systems, and rendered homes uninhabitable. From my vantage point, I felt a mixture of triumph and guilt. The flood was working exactly as planned, forcing a halt to the illegal development and sending a message to Karen and the HOA. But I also knew innocent families were caught in the crossfire, many of whom had bought their homes in good faith. The moral weight of my actions pressed heavily on me. As the floodwater stabilized, I monitored the situation closely, coordinating with local environmental experts and sympathetic officials. We tracked the damage, made sure emergency responders had access, and tried to mitigate risks of contamination or injury. The news media descended on Willow Creek estates with a frenzy. Drones captured dramatic footage of flooded streets and waterlogged homes. Reporters interviewed panicked residents, environmentalists, and me, the mysterious landowner behind the flood. The story went viral, igniting debates across social media platforms, talk shows, and local government meetings. Karen's response was predictable and fierce. She issued statements condemning me as a vigilante and criminal, accused me of endangering lives, and vowed to sue for damages. The HOA board rallied behind her, desperate to protect their investments and reputation. But the tide of public opinion largely favored me. Many people saw the flood as a dramatic but justified act of resistance against blatant corruption and environmental destruction. Editorials praised the exposure of the HOA's illegal activities and called for thorough investigations. The legal battles intensified. The courts, under growing public pressure, expedited hearings and ordered a temporary halt to all HOA activities on my land. Investigations uncovered the extent of forged documents, bribery of local officials, and environmental violations tied to the development. The floodwaters receded slowly over weeks, leaving behind mud, debris, and damaged properties. Cleanup efforts began, funded partially by emergency relief and partially by HOA insurance claims. The once pristine valley was scarred, but the land was slowly reclaiming itself. In the aftermath, the community remained divided but more aware. Some homeowners, angry and displaced, banded together to seek restitution and reforms in the HOA leadership. Others expressed regret for buying into a project built on lies. Local government agencies launched reforms aimed at preventing similar corruption in the future. I continued working with environmental groups to restore the natural habitats damaged by the construction and the flood. We planted trees, cleared debris from the creek, and installed new flood controls designed to protect the land without harming residents. Karen disappeared from public view. Her reign over Willow Creek estates effectively ended. The HOA dissolved under mounting lawsuits and lost credibility. The property titles were put under review, with court-appointed trustees overseeing the land's future. For me, the battle was bittersweet. I had reclaimed my land in a way no court or letter ever could, but at a cost. The flood changed lives, uprooted families, and left scars on the landscape I loved. It was a stark reminder that sometimes justice isn't neat or clean. It's messy, complicated, and deeply human. Still, standing on the hill where the houses once loomed, watching new green shoots sprout from the mud, I felt a flicker of hope. The land was healing, The truth was out, and the fight for what's right was never truly over.